Lieutenant Commander James "Jimmy" McKenzie gripped the stick of his Grumman F-6F Hellcat as lightning illuminated the towering walls of cloud that surrounded him on all sides. The date was October 23, 1943, and he was flying alone through the heart of a Pacific typhoon, 300 miles northwest of the Marshall Islands. His radio crackled with static, and the increasingly frantic voice of his squadron commander ordering him to turn back immediately, but McKenzie had switched off his transmitter 5 minutes ago. Through the deafening roar of wind and rain battering his canopy, he could hear something else, a low rhythmic thrum that seemed to vibrate through the storm itself. It wasn't thunder, it wasn't his engine. It was the synchronized pulse of dozens of ship engines, and it was getting louder. McKenzie knew that somewhere in this wall of black chaos, hidden from every American search plane and reconnaissance mission, lay the most powerful enemy fleet assembled in the Central Pacific since the attack on Pearl Harbor. His fuel gauge showed 23 minutes of flying time remaining. His compass spun wildly. His altimeter fluctuated between readings that made no sense. Every regulation, every piece of training, every direct order from command told him to retreat to safety. Instead, he pushed his throttle forward and flew deeper into the storm, guided only by the sound of engines that shouldn't exist, and the growing certainty that his disobedience would either save thousands of American lives or add his name to the list of pilots lost without a trace. No one in Task Force 58 knew that one man's defiance that morning would rewrite the rules of naval reconnaissance and turn the tide of the largest carrier battle in the Central Pacific. James McKenzie had grown up in the wheat fields of Kansas, where the only sounds that carried for miles were the rumble of distant thunder and the whistle of trains crossing the prairie at dawn. Born on a farm outside Hays in 1917, he learned early that survival often meant trusting your instincts over conventional wisdom. His father, a grain elevator operator who had served in the trenches of France during the Great War, taught him that courage wasn't the absence of fear but the willingness to act despite it. Mackenzie's mother, a former schoolteacher, insisted that her son learn to play piano, and by age 12 he could identify any note, chord progression, or harmonic interval by ear alone. This perfect pitch would prove useful in ways neither parent could have imagined. When he graduated from Hays High School in 1935, McKenzie planned to study agriculture at Kansas State, but the bombing of Pearl Harbor changed everything. On December 8, 1941, the day after the attack, he drove to the Naval Recruiting Station in Topeka and enlisted as an aviation cadet. His recruiter, a weathered chief petty officer who had served on destroyers in the Atlantic, looked at the lanky farm boy and asked why he wanted to fly. Mackenzie's answer was simple: because the enemy won't expect someone from Kansas to find them in the middle of the ocean. The chief laughed and stamped his papers. 6 months later, Mackenzie was learning to fly SNJ Texans at Naval Air Station Pensacola, where his instructors quickly discovered he possessed an unusual gift for instrument flying and navigation. While other cadets struggled with blind flying techniques, Mackenzie seemed to navigate by instinct, often landing within feet of his target, after flying through cloud cover for hours. His flight instructor, Lieutenant Commander Robert Hayes, noted in Mackenzie's training records that the young pilot displayed exceptional spatial awareness and an uncanny ability to maintain orientation in zero visibility conditions. What Hayes didn't know was that Mackenzie was using his musical ear to navigate, listening to engine harmonics, wind patterns, and radio frequency variations to build a mental map of his position. He graduated from flight training in the top 5% of his class and was assigned to Bombing Fighting Squadron 16 aboard the USS Lexington. His squadron mates, veterans of the Coral Sea and Midway battles, initially viewed the quiet Kansas farm boy with skepticism. He didn't boast about his flying skills or tell war stories in the ready room. He simply listened, observed, and flew better formation than pilots with twice his experience. By the spring of 1943, he had earned the respect of every man in VF-16 through precise flying and an almost supernatural ability to spot enemy aircraft before anyone else. He had no idea that soon those instincts would be all that stood between life and annihilation for the largest American naval force ever assembled in the Pacific. The autumn of 1943 marked a critical turning point in the Pacific War. American forces had secured victory at Guadalcanal and were preparing for the massive offensive that would crack the outer ring of Japanese defenses. Intelligence reports indicated that Admiral Yamamoto's successor was massing the combined fleet for a decisive battle somewhere in the Central Pacific. But American reconnaissance had failed to locate the enemy force. The stakes could not have been higher. Task Force 58, under the command of Admiral Raymond Spruance, represented the largest concentration of American naval power in the Pacific. 6 fleet carriers, 8 escort carriers, 7 battleships, and more than 60 destroyers and cruisers. If the Japanese could achieve tactical surprise and strike first, they might destroy American carrier aviation and extend the war by years. The Japanese plan, as American codebreakers later learned, was elegant in its simplicity. Using the seasonal typhoon systems that swept through the Central Pacific in October, they would conceal their fleet within the storm fronts, invisible to American search aircraft, and launch a coordinated attack on the approaching American task force. For weeks, American patrol planes had flown search patterns covering thousands of square miles of ocean, finding nothing but empty water and storm clouds. The Japanese fleet, comprising 4 fleet carriers, 2 battleships, and 18 destroyers, had been moving through the typhoon systems for 5 days, using the storms as natural camouflage. American commanders, growing increasingly frustrated by the lack of contact reports, began to suspect that either their intelligence was wrong or the enemy had withdrawn entirely. Admiral Spruance, a veteran of Midway who understood the importance of finding the enemy first, authorized extended search missions despite the deteriorating weather conditions. On the morning of October 23rd, Mackenzie's squadron was assigned to search the northwestern quadrant, an area of ocean that meteorologists had declared impassable due to typhoon activity. The mission briefing, conducted in the cramped ready room of the Lexington, was sobering. Squadron Commander Robert Iron Mike Morrison, a veteran of the Coral Sea who bore a scar across his left cheek from enemy shrapnel, stood before a map covered with red symbols marking storm systems. "Gentlemen," Morrison said, his voice carrying the weight of experience, "we're looking for ghosts. 4 days of search missions have turned up nothing, but intelligence insists they're out there. Weather reports show typhoon conditions extending from grid squares 7 through 12. Ceiling 0, visibility 0, winds gusting to 90 knots. Under normal circumstances, I wouldn't send a paper airplane into that mess." He paused, looking at each pilot in turn. "But these aren't normal circumstances. If that fleet is hiding in those storms and we don't find them, they'll hit us at dawn tomorrow with everything they've got." The mathematics of the situation were stark. They were searching for a force of approximately 30 ships scattered across 50,000 square miles of storm-tossed ocean, and they had 6 hours of daylight remaining. The pre-flight briefing concluded with specific orders that would prove crucial to the day's events. Morrison's instructions were clear and unambiguous. Search to maximum range. Report any contacts immediately, but do not, repeat, do not enter typhoon conditions. If you encounter severe weather, turn back. We need pilots alive to fight tomorrow, not heroes at the bottom of the Pacific. Mackenzie listened carefully, but as he walked to his aircraft, he felt the familiar tightness in his chest that always preceded important missions. His plane captain, aviation machinist's mate, First Class Tony Ricci, a mechanic from Brooklyn who could diagnose engine problems by sound alone, had spent 3 hours that morning going over every rivet and wire in Mackenzie's Hellcat. "She's running sweet, Lieutenant Commander," Ricci reported, wiping grease from his hands with a rag. "Fuel tanks topped off, guns loaded, radio checked twice. Just promise me you'll bring her back in one piece." Mackenzie nodded and climbed into the cockpit, running through his pre-flight checklist with the methodical precision that had kept him alive through 27 combat missions. As he taxied toward the catapult, he noticed the barometric pressure readings on the ship's weatherboard. They were dropping rapidly, indicating severe storm activity ahead. The launch sequence proceeded normally until Mackenzie was airborne and forming up with his wingman, Ensign David Patterson, a recent flight school graduate from Oregon who had joined the squadron only 3 weeks earlier. Patterson, flying his 4th combat mission, stayed in tight formation as they climbed toward their assigned search altitude of 8,000 feet. The weather deteriorated rapidly as they flew northwest, with visibility dropping to less than 2 miles as scattered rain showers merged into solid overcast. After 40 minutes of flight, they encountered the outer bands of the Typhoon system. The turbulence was immediate and violent, throwing both aircraft around like toys. Mackenzie radioed Patterson to spread out to avoid mid-air collision, but the young ensign's voice crackled back with barely controlled panic. "Lead, I'm getting bounced around pretty hard here. My artificial horizon is tumbling and my compass is spinning. Request permission to turn back." Mackenzie looked ahead at the wall of black clouds that stretched to the horizon. Every instinct told him to follow standing orders and return to base, but as he banked to turn back, he heard something that made him freeze. Through the howl of wind and the roar of his engine, there was another sound, a deep, rhythmic vibration that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. It was the sound of synchronized marine engines, dozens of them, running at cruising speed, somewhere in the heart of the storm. He had heard similar sounds during night convoy operations, when multiple ships maintained station by matching engine rhythms. The sound was faint but unmistakable, and it was coming from dead ahead deep in the Typhoon. Mackenzie faced the decision that would define his career and potentially alter the course of the Pacific War. Standing orders were clear: turn back and avoid the storm. His wingman was struggling with instrument failure and needed escort back to the carrier. Fuel consumption would increase dramatically in the turbulence ahead, reducing his margin for error to almost nothing. But that sound, the rhythmic pulse of multiple ship engines, meant that somewhere in the chaos ahead lay the Japanese fleet that had eluded American forces for nearly a week. Mackenzie made his choice with the swift certainty that characterized all his best decisions. He radioed Patterson with instructions to return to base immediately, providing a false position report to avoid revealing his own intentions. "Viper 2, this is Viper Lead. I'm showing a fuel leak and need to return on a direct heading. You proceed back to base and report negative contact this sector." It was a lie, but one that would keep the young ensign safe and provide cover for Mackenzie's unauthorized mission into the storm. Patterson, fighting increasingly severe turbulence, acknowledged the transmission and banked southeast toward the Lexington. Mackenzie watched his wingman disappear into the clouds, then switched off his radio transmitter and turned northwest into the heart of the Typhoon. The transition from rough weather to full storm conditions was like flying through a waterfall. Rain hammered his canopy with such force that visibility dropped to zero within seconds. Lightning illuminated mountainous clouds that towered above and below his aircraft, while turbulence threw him around the cockpit despite his safety harness. His airspeed indicator fluctuated wildly. His altimeter gave readings that contradicted his compass, and his artificial horizon tumbled uselessly as the gyroscopes failed to compensate for the violent motion. Under normal circumstances, any pilot would immediately execute an emergency turn to escape such conditions. Instead, Mackenzie closed his eyes and flew by sound and feel, using techniques he had developed during childhood nights on the Kansas prairie when he would lie in wheat fields and identify distant sounds, trains, automobiles, aircraft, by their acoustic signatures. The sound of the ship engines was clearer now, a deep harmonic progression that suggested large vessels maintaining formation. Mackenzie adjusted his heading by 10 degrees and flew toward the sound, using minute changes in engine tone to guide his navigation. After 20 minutes of blind flying through conditions that should have been impossible to survive, he began to see breaks in the cloud cover below. The storm was starting to clear from the bottom up, and through brief gaps in the overcast, he caught glimpses of something that made his heart race. There were ships down there, not one or two, but dozens of them, arranged in the precise geometric patterns that characterized a major fleet formation. The sight that greeted Mackenzie as he descended through the clearing, storm would be burned into his memory for the rest of his life. Spread across 15 miles of churning ocean, partially concealed by lingering rain squalls and low clouds, was the largest Japanese naval force he had ever seen. 4 aircraft carriers steamed in box formation at the center of the fleet, their flight decks crowded with aircraft being prepared for launch. 2 massive battleships, which Mackenzie immediately recognized as Yamato-class vessels, provided close escort to the carriers. A screen of destroyers and cruisers surrounded the main force, their anti-aircraft guns already turning skyward as lookouts spotted his lone Hellcat. Mackenzie counted quickly, 31 ships in total, including what appeared to be 2 fleet oilers and several transport vessels. This was not just a strike force, it was an invasion fleet capable of seizing and holding territory. The tactical situation was clear and terrifying. The Japanese fleet was positioned perfectly to launch a surprise attack on Task Force 58, which was approaching from the southeast, completely unaware of the enemy's presence. Based on his current position and the fleet's heading, Mackenzie calculated that the Japanese could launch their attack within 6 hours, achieving complete tactical surprise. He had found the enemy, but now he faced an even more difficult challenge: how to report their position when his radio was switched off and his fuel gauge showed only 18 minutes of flying time remaining. The storm was clearing rapidly, which meant he would soon be visible to every anti-aircraft gun in the fleet. Already, he could see muzzle flashes from the nearest destroyer as gunners opened fire at maximum range. Mackenzie had 2 choices: attempt to fight his way out of the area and radio a contact report, or stay hidden in the remaining storm clouds and try to gather more intelligence on enemy intentions. The decision was complicated by another factor he hadn't anticipated. As he watched the carrier operations below, he realized the Japanese were not preparing for an immediate attack. Aircraft were being moved from hangar decks to flight decks, but the slow, methodical pace suggested they were planning a dawn strike rather than an immediate launch. This gave him precious hours to warn Task Force 58, but only if he could survive the next few minutes and find a way to communicate his discovery. Mackenzie pulled his aircraft up into the base of the remaining storm clouds and began flying a careful reconnaissance pattern, using the weather for concealment while gathering intelligence that would prove crucial to American victory. For the next 12 minutes, Mackenzie flew the most dangerous reconnaissance mission of the Pacific War. Using his remaining fuel with the precision of a man who understood that every gallon might mean the difference between victory and disaster, he systematically observed and memorized the composition, heading, and apparent intentions of the enemy fleet. The 4 carriers, which he identified as 2 Shokaku class and 2 smaller vessels, were conducting flight operations with unusual caution. Instead of launching immediate strikes, they appeared to be positioning aircraft for a coordinated dawn attack. The battleships maintained station exactly 2,000 yards from the carrier formation, their massive guns trained on different sectors of the sky. Most significantly, Mackenzie observed that the entire fleet was steaming at 15 knots on a heading that would bring them within strike range of the American task force by 0530 hours the following morning. He had discovered not just the location of the Japanese fleet, but their complete battle plan. The intelligence was priceless, but worthless unless he could communicate it to his own forces. With his fuel gauge showing 11 minutes of flying time remaining, Mackenzie made another decision that defied all conventional tactical wisdom. Instead of attempting to escape immediately, he descended to deck level and flew directly across the enemy formation, passing within 500 yards of the lead carrier while enemy gunners filled the sky with anti-aircraft fire. His purpose was not suicidal bravado, but careful observation. He was counting aircraft types, noting damage to ships, and most importantly, looking for any indication of radar installations that might detect incoming American strikes. What he saw convinced him that the Japanese fleet, while powerful, possessed a critical vulnerability. The carriers appeared to be operating independently rather than under central fighter direction, and their combat air patrol was notably light, only 8 aircraft providing cover for the entire force. This suggested that American fighters, properly coordinated, could achieve air superiority over the enemy fleet. Mackenzie pulled his aircraft into a steep climb and headed southeast, flying through the last remnants of the storm while composing the most important radio transmission of his career. He switched on his radio and immediately heard the frantic voice of his squadron commander, demanding his position and status. "Viper Base, this is Viper Lead," Mackenzie transmitted, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what he was about to report. "I have multiple contacts, repeat, multiple contacts bearing 310 degrees from Point Zulu at range 270 miles. Estimate 4 carriers, 2 battleships, multiple escorts. Fleet course 135 degrees, speed 15 knots. Enemy appears to be preparing for dawn strike operations. Request immediate relay to flag." The response was immediate and electric with disbelief. The radio transmission that followed would be studied in naval academies for decades. Squadron Commander Morrison's voice crackled through the static with a mixture of astonishment and professional skepticism that characterized experienced combat leaders receiving impossible information. Viper Lead. Confirm your position and the nature of your contact report. You are reporting a major fleet unit in the middle of a typhoon system that weather has declared impassable. Mackenzie, now flying through clearing skies with his fuel gauge showing 6 minutes remaining, responded with the precise terminology that would leave no doubt about the accuracy of his observation. Viper Base. I have visual confirmation of 4 enemy carriers conducting flight operations. Repeat, visual confirmation. 2 Shokaku-class vessels and 2 smaller carriers, plus escorts, including 2 Yamato-class battleships. Current position 31 degrees north, 167 degrees east. Fleet is maintaining formation speed 15 knots on heading 135 degrees. Estimate enemy will be in strike position against our force by 0530 tomorrow. I observed aircraft being spotted for launch on all 4 flight decks. Combat air patrol appears light, approximately 8 fighters. The transmission was relayed directly to Admiral Spruance aboard the USS Indianapolis, where it arrived like lightning in a clear sky. For nearly a week, American intelligence had been searching for this fleet, and now a single pilot had not only found them but provided tactical intelligence that would determine the outcome of the battle. Spruance, a commander who had learned at Midway to trust his pilots' contact reports despite their apparent impossibility, immediately began issuing orders that would position American forces for a decisive victory. But Mackenzie's mission was far from over. As he turned southeast toward Task Force 58, his engine began to run rough, a sign that fuel starvation was imminent. His aircraft was still 90 miles from the nearest American ship, and the weather was deteriorating again as another storm front approached from the west. He had found the enemy and reported their position, but unless he could return safely with additional intelligence, much of what he had observed would be lost. Mackenzie throttled back to maximum endurance setting and began the most critical navigation challenge of his career, finding a moving carrier task force in marginal weather with virtually no fuel remaining. Once again, he would have to rely on sound and instinct rather than conventional navigation methods. As his engine began to miss cylinders and his fuel gauge touched zero, he started listening for the distinctive sound signature of American ships, the higher-pitched whine of steam turbines rather than the diesel rumble he had heard from the Japanese fleet. The final phase of Mackenzie's unauthorized mission tested every skill he had developed as both pilot and navigator. Flying at wave-top level to conserve fuel, he followed his compass heading while listening for any sound that might indicate the presence of friendly forces. His engine ran increasingly rough as the last traces of aviation gasoline burned away, forcing him to consider the very real possibility of ditching in heavy seas with minimal chance of rescue. The ironies of his situation were not lost on him. He had located the most important enemy fleet in the Central Pacific, but might die before anyone could act on his intelligence. After 18 minutes of maximum endurance flying, his engine quit entirely, leaving him in a powerless glide toward the ocean surface. In the sudden silence that followed, he heard the sound he had been hoping for, the high-frequency whine of steam turbines and the rhythmic throbbing of destroyer engines. Task Force 58 was directly ahead, invisible in the gathering dusk, but audible to a pilot who had learned to navigate by sound. Mackenzie executed a dead-stick landing approach toward the sound, hoping to spot the task force before hitting the water. At 300 feet altitude, he saw them. The angular silhouettes of American destroyers and cruisers spread across 5 miles of ocean, with the distinctive profile of the USS Lexington visible in the center of the formation. Mackenzie's aircraft had enough momentum for one approach to the carrier's flight deck. There would be no opportunity for a wave-off or second attempt. The landing signal officer aboard the Lexington, Lieutenant J.G. William Paddles Peterson, was not expecting returning aircraft and was startled to see a lone Hellcat approaching the ship with its engine silent. Peterson quickly realized he was watching a dead-stick approach and began signaling for an emergency landing. Mackenzie, flying entirely by feel and visual reference, brought his aircraft across the carrier's wake at exactly the right speed and altitude. The landing was perfect. His tail hook caught the number 3 wire and brought his aircraft to a stop with less than 50 feet of deck remaining. As plane handlers chocked his wheels and medical personnel rushed to check his condition, Mackenzie was already climbing out of his cockpit with additional intelligence that would prove crucial to American victory. He had not only found the enemy fleet, but had gathered tactical information about their intentions, capabilities, and vulnerabilities that would allow American forces to achieve complete surprise in the coming battle. The intelligence debrief that followed Mackenzie's landing lasted 3 hours and involved every senior staff officer in Task Force 58. Admiral Spruance himself, a man known for his calm demeanor under pressure, listened intently as Mackenzie described in precise detail everything he had observed during his unauthorized reconnaissance. The tactical picture that emerged was both alarming and encouraging. The Japanese fleet was exactly where American intelligence had predicted, but their intentions were more sophisticated than previously understood. Rather than seeking immediate battle, they were positioning for a coordinated dawn strike that would catch American forces at their most vulnerable moment, during morning flight operations, when most aircraft would be on deck being fueled and armed. Mackenzie's description of enemy aircraft positioning confirmed this assessment. The Japanese carriers were conducting what appeared to be rehearsal operations, practicing the precise timing that would be necessary for a successful surprise attack. However, Mackenzie had also identified critical vulnerabilities in the enemy formation. The Light Combat Air Patrol suggested that Japanese commanders were confident in their concealment and not expecting immediate attack. More importantly, the dispersed formation of their carriers made them vulnerable to coordinated strikes from multiple directions. Admiral Spruance, drawing on his experience at Midway, immediately recognized the opportunity Mackenzie's intelligence provided. Instead of waiting for the Japanese to attack at dawn, American forces could launch a preemptive strike during the hours of darkness, achieving complete tactical surprise. The plan that emerged from the staff meeting would become known as the Battle of Leyte Gulf Approach, named for the tactical principles first employed in that campaign. Mackenzie's unauthorized mission had not only located the enemy, but provided the intelligence necessary for American forces to seize the initiative. The subsequent battle, fought over 2 days in late October 1943, resulted in the destruction of 3 Japanese carriers and the effective end of Japanese carrier aviation as a major threat in the Pacific War. Post-battle analysis revealed that Mackenzie's contact report had been accurate in every detail, and his assessment of enemy intentions had been precisely correct. The Japanese fleet had indeed been preparing for a dawn strike that would have devastated American forces if achieved by surprise. Instead, American aircraft launched their attack at 0300 hours, catching the enemy fleet completely unprepared and achieving one of the most decisive tactical victories in naval history. The immediate aftermath of Mackenzie's return to the Lexington revealed the complex relationships between military regulations, individual initiative, and combat effectiveness that would influence American naval doctrine for generations. Admiral Spruance, despite his appreciation for the intelligence Mackenzie had provided, was faced with the difficult question of how to handle a pilot who had deliberately disobeyed direct orders from his squadron commander. Military law was clear. Mackenzie had violated Article 92 of the Uniform Code of Military Justice by failing to obey a lawful order, and the potential consequences ranged from court-martial to dismissal from naval service. However, the results of his disobedience had been so spectacular that prosecuting him would send exactly the wrong message about initiative and tactical innovation. The solution that emerged reflected the pragmatic wisdom that characterized American military leadership during the Second World War. Mackenzie was quietly transferred to Admiral Spruance's staff as an intelligence specialist, a position that removed him from operational flying, but allowed the Navy to benefit from his unique skills in reconnaissance and tactical analysis. His squadron, VF-16, was told that their executive officer had been promoted to an important staff position, while his personnel file contained no mention of disciplinary action. The official record of the mission was classified at the highest levels, with only a brief notation that Lieutenant Commander Mackenzie had conducted exceptional reconnaissance leading to significant tactical advantage. What Mackenzie learned from his squadron mates years later was that his unauthorized mission had saved the lives of virtually everyone in Task Force 58. Intelligence analysis conducted after the battle revealed that if the Japanese had achieved surprise with their dawn attack, they could have sunk or crippled at least 3 American carriers and killed thousands of naval personnel. His decision to disobey orders and fly into the Typhoon had prevented one of the greatest potential disasters in American naval history. The psychological impact on his fellow pilots was equally significant. Stories of Mackenzie's sound navigation techniques spread throughout the Pacific Fleet, inspiring other aviators to develop innovative approaches to reconnaissance and navigation. Several pilots began experimenting with acoustic navigation methods, leading to improvements in search and rescue operations that saved dozens of lives in subsequent campaigns. Mackenzie himself rarely spoke about the mission, maintaining the quiet professionalism that had characterized his entire naval career. When pressed by fellow staff officers about his decision-making during the flight, his response was typically understated. "I heard something that didn't belong in a Typhoon, so I went to investigate." This casual dismissal of what amounted to extraordinary heroism became legendary among Pacific Fleet personnel, contributing to a culture of initiative and innovation that would serve American forces well in the final campaigns of the war. Mackenzie's post-war life reflected the same quiet competence and understated heroism that had characterized his naval service. After the Japanese surrender in August 1945, he returned to Kansas with a chest full of decorations he never displayed and stories he rarely told. He used his GI Bill benefits to complete a degree in aeronautical engineering at Kansas State University, where his professors noted his exceptional understanding of aircraft performance and navigation systems. His senior thesis, titled Acoustic Navigation Techniques for Military Aviation, became required reading in the university's flight training program and influenced several Air Force pilot training manuals. In 1948, he married Sarah Williams, a nurse he had met during his recovery from a minor flying accident at Naval Air Station Pensacola. Sarah later recalled that Jimmy had never mentioned his wartime flying experiences until their 3rd anniversary, when a letter arrived from a pilot named Patterson, who was thanking Mackenzie for saving his life during that Typhoon mission. When Sarah asked about the letter, Mackenzie's response was characteristic. "We all looked out for each other in those days. That's what shipmates do." The couple settled in Hutchinson, Kansas, where Mackenzie worked as a civilian flight instructor at the local airport, while also serving as a consulting engineer for aircraft manufacturers. His reputation for innovative problem-solving attracted attention from companies developing new navigation systems, and he held patents on several acoustic guidance devices that improved civilian aviation safety. Throughout the 1950s and 60s, he received periodic visits from former naval aviators who had served in the Pacific, many of whom credited Mackenzie's tactical innovations with their own survival. David Patterson, his former wingman, became a commercial airline pilot and made annual trips to Kansas to visit the man who had sent him safely home during the Typhoon mission. Patterson later wrote in his memoir that Mackenzie taught me more about courage and initiative in 5 minutes of radio conversation than I learned in 4 years of military training. The lessons of Mackenzie's unauthorized reconnaissance mission continued to influence American military thinking long after the war ended. Staff colleges began including case studies of the mission in their curricula on initiative versus obedience, using Mackenzie's decision-making process as an example of how individual judgment could override institutional protocols when tactical conditions warranted such action. The acoustic navigation techniques he had developed were formally incorporated into Navy search and rescue procedures, saving dozens of lives in subsequent years. Mackenzie himself remained characteristically modest about his contributions, often deflecting credit to his squadron mates and superior officers. When contacted by military historians researching the Pacific War, his standard response was, "I was just doing my job. The real heroes were the guys who didn't make it home." The broader historical significance of Mackenzie's mission extended far beyond its immediate tactical impact. Military analysts studying the operation identified several factors that made it a turning point in American naval doctrine. First, it demonstrated the limitations of rigid adherence to operational protocols when faced with rapidly changing battlefield conditions. Mackenzie's decision to violate direct orders had prevented a strategic disaster, proving that individual initiative, properly applied, could be more valuable than institutional compliance. This lesson influenced post-war training programs that emphasized situational awareness and independent judgment rather than mechanical obedience to orders. Second, the mission highlighted the importance of unconventional skills in military operations. Mackenzie's musical background and acoustic sensitivity had proven more valuable than advanced navigation equipment, suggesting that military effectiveness sometimes depended on abilities that couldn't be taught through standard training programs. This insight led to recruitment policies that sought candidates with diverse backgrounds and unusual skill sets, rather than focusing exclusively on traditional military qualifications. Third, the operation provided conclusive evidence that technological superiority could be overcome through tactical innovation and superior intelligence gathering. The Japanese fleet had possessed radar, advanced aircraft, and numerical advantage, but Mackenzie's acoustic navigation and systematic observation had negated these advantages through better intelligence and superior positioning. Military planners drew from this lesson the understanding that information warfare and tactical intelligence could be more decisive than raw firepower. These insights influenced American military doctrine throughout the Cold War period and beyond. Special operations units began incorporating acoustic tracking techniques into their training programs, while naval aviation schools developed courses in unconventional navigation methods. The mission also contributed to the development of early electronic intelligence gathering systems, as engineers attempted to replicate Mackenzie's acoustic detection methods using technological rather than human sensors. Perhaps most significantly, Mackenzie's mission became a case study in the balance between military discipline and individual initiative. Staff colleges used the operation to train officers in the difficult art of knowing when to break rules and when to follow them, a skill that proved crucial in subsequent conflicts where rigid adherence to doctrine often proved counterproductive. The mission demonstrated that true military effectiveness required not just obedience and courage, but the wisdom to distinguish between situations that demanded compliance and those that required innovation. The technical aspects of Mackenzie's acoustic navigation breakthrough continued to influence aviation development for decades after the war. His ability to navigate through zero visibility conditions using only engine sounds and harmonic patterns inspired research into acoustic guidance systems that eventually contributed to the development of sonar and early radar technologies. Civilian aviation adopted several navigation techniques derived from his wartime innovations, particularly in search and rescue operations where traditional navigation aids were unavailable or unreliable. Mackenzie's methods proved especially valuable in mountain rescue operations, where pilots could use sound reflection patterns to navigate through cloud-covered terrain. The psychological dimensions of his achievement were equally significant for military training programs. Educational psychologists studying the mission identified several factors that had contributed to Mackenzie's success under extreme stress. His childhood development of perfect pitch had created neural pathways that allowed him to process auditory information with exceptional precision. His farm background had taught him to remain calm under pressure and make critical decisions with limited information. Most importantly, his naval training had given him confidence in his own judgment, while also teaching him when to trust institutional wisdom and when to rely on individual initiative. These insights influenced pilot selection criteria throughout the military aviation community. The Navy began testing candidates for acoustic sensitivity and spatial awareness, while flight training programs incorporated exercises designed to develop sound-based navigation skills. The Air Force adopted similar measures, recognizing that future conflicts might require pilots to operate in environments where traditional navigation aids were compromised or unavailable. Mackenzie's legacy extended beyond military aviation into civilian emergency services, where his techniques influenced the development of search and rescue protocols still used today. Mountain rescue teams, Coast Guard units, and emergency medical services adopted acoustic navigation methods that allowed them to locate victims in low-visibility conditions. The fundamental principles he had demonstrated, that careful listening could provide navigation information unavailable through other means, became standard doctrine in emergency operations worldwide. When Mackenzie passed away in 1987, his funeral was attended by more than 200 veterans of Pacific War aviation, many of whom credited their survival to tactical innovations that traced their origins to his Typhoon mission. The memorial service, held at the First Methodist Church in Hutchinson, included readings from letters written by pilots he had never met, but whose lives had been saved by the acoustic navigation techniques he had developed under combat conditions. The letters and testimonies that emerged following Mackenzie's death revealed the true scope of his influence on American military aviation. Captain David Patterson, now retired from commercial aviation, delivered a eulogy that captured the essence of Mackenzie's character and contributions. "Jimmy Mackenzie taught us that courage isn't about following orders or breaking them," Patterson said. "It's about having the wisdom to know which choice will save the most lives, and then having the strength to act on that knowledge regardless of personal cost." The service included readings from dozens of letters written by former Pacific War pilots, many describing specific incidents where Mackenzie's innovations had made the difference between life and death. Lieutenant Commander Robert Hayes, Mackenzie's former flight instructor, had written, "In 40 years of military aviation, I never met another pilot who could navigate by instinct the way Jimmy could. He didn't just fly aircraft, he seemed to become part of them, sensing things that instruments couldn't measure." Perhaps the most moving testimony came from Admiral Spruance himself, who had written a letter shortly before his own death in 1969. Lieutenant Commander Mackenzie's mission on October 23, 1943, exemplified the finest traditions of naval aviation. His decision to disobey direct orders in pursuit of tactical intelligence required exactly the kind of initiative and judgment that distinguishes great military leaders from merely good ones. The American victory in the Central Pacific can be traced directly to the intelligence he provided that day, intelligence that could only have been gathered by a pilot willing to risk everything for the success of his mission. The technical manual that Mackenzie had written during his post-war engineering studies became required reading at the Naval War College, where it was used to teach advanced navigation techniques to successive generations of military aviators. His patent applications for acoustic guidance systems influenced the development of several important navigation technologies, including early forms of GPS and inertial guidance systems. More broadly, his approach to problem-solving, combining technical knowledge with intuitive judgment, became a model for military innovation programs throughout the armed services. The Mackenzie method, as it came to be known in aviation circles, emphasized the importance of developing multiple sensory navigation techniques rather than relying exclusively on technological systems. This approach proved prescient during later conflicts where electronic navigation aids were compromised by enemy action or environmental conditions. Pilots trained in Mackenzie's techniques consistently demonstrated superior performance in low-visibility operations, contributing to mission success rates that exceeded those achieved through conventional navigation methods alone. The institutional changes that resulted from Mackenzie's mission continued to influence American military culture long after the Second World War ended. His example provided compelling evidence that military effectiveness often depended on individual initiative rather than rigid adherence to doctrine, leading to training programs that emphasized creative problem-solving over mechanical obedience. The Navy incorporated case studies of his decision-making process into leadership courses, using his mission as an example of how tactical judgment could override institutional protocols when circumstances warranted such action. These lessons proved crucial during the Korean War, when American pilots frequently encountered situations where standard operating procedures were inadequate for the challenges they faced. Pilots who had studied Mackenzie's methods demonstrated superior performance in unconventional reconnaissance missions, contributing to intelligence-gathering operations that influenced strategic decision-making at the highest levels. The acoustic navigation techniques he had pioneered proved especially valuable in mountainous terrain, where traditional radio navigation aids were often unreliable due to terrain interference. During the Vietnam conflict, Special Operations Units adopted modified versions of Mackenzie's sound-based navigation methods for operations in jungle environments where visibility was severely limited. The fundamental principle he had established, that careful observation of environmental cues could provide navigation information unavailable through technological means, became standard doctrine for Special Forces operations worldwide. His influence extended beyond navigation techniques to encompass broader questions of military leadership and individual responsibility. Staff colleges throughout the military establishment used his mission as a case study in moral courage, demonstrating how individual judgment could serve strategic objectives even when it required violation of direct orders. The Mackenzie Doctrine, as military ethicists termed it, established criteria for distinguishing between lawful disobedience that served mission objectives and unlawful insubordination that threatened military effectiveness. These distinctions proved crucial during later conflicts where rapid technological change and unconventional enemy tactics required constant adaptation of established procedures. Officers trained in Mackenzie's decision-making principles consistently demonstrated superior performance in fluid tactical situations, contributing to mission success rates that exceeded those achieved through conventional command structures. The broader cultural impact of his mission reinforced American military traditions of individual initiative and innovative thinking that distinguished American forces from their more rigidly structured adversaries. As we reflect on Lieutenant Commander James Mackenzie's extraordinary mission more than 8 decades after that stormy October morning, the lessons of his courage and initiative remain as relevant today as they were during the height of the Pacific War. His decision to fly into a typhoon armed only with perfect pitch and an unshakable belief in his own judgment represents the finest traditions of American military innovation, the willingness to challenge conventional wisdom when human lives hang in the balance. The mathematics of his achievement are staggering. By locating the Japanese fleet and providing tactical intelligence that enabled a preemptive strike, Mackenzie's unauthorized mission prevented what could have been the loss of 3 American aircraft carriers, 8,000 naval personnel, and potentially the entire strategic initiative in the Central Pacific. His 4 hours of disobedience changed the trajectory of the Pacific War and demonstrated that individual courage, properly applied, could alter the course of history itself. The technical innovations he developed under combat conditions continued to save lives for decades after the war ended, while his example inspired countless other military personnel to trust their judgment and act decisively when faced with impossible choices. Perhaps most significantly, Mackenzie's mission established enduring principles about the relationship between military discipline and individual initiative that continue to influence American military doctrine today. He proved that true military effectiveness requires not just the courage to follow orders, but the wisdom to know when breaking those orders serves a higher purpose. His legacy reminds us that the most important battles are often won not by those who follow rules most carefully, but by those who understand when the rules themselves must be transcended in service of greater objectives. The sound of those enemy engines vibrating through a Pacific typhoon on an October morning in 1943 called forth a response that exemplified the very best of American military tradition: individual initiative in service of collective survival, innovative thinking under impossible pressure, and the moral courage to act decisively when the stakes could not be higher. Mackenzie's story challenges us to consider our own response to impossible circumstances. When faced with a choice between safety and duty, between orders and conscience, between following the rules and saving lives, would we have the courage to fly blind into the storm, guided only by our conviction that somewhere in the chaos ahead lay the answer to our prayers and the salvation of our cause? His legacy suggests that such moments of moral clarity, when individual courage intersects with historical necessity, define not just military careers, but the character of nations themselves. Comment below and share this story so others remember what courage really means.